Embark on a journey with us where resilience meets opportunity. This is the Dirt Road to Success.
Hi, I'm Skip Colvin, host for Dirt Road to Success. So what is Dirt Road to Success? Dirt Road to Success is a new book that's coming out next year that I'll be getting published. And we have a podcast that's really dedicated to discussing faith, family, and work topics. So what does that mean, Dirt Road to Success? Well, everybody that is successful looks back over their career or their situation, and they see opportunities that they've had to go through potholes and go down dirt roads and twist and turns to get to where they are. Most people see successful people and they think, oh, they've been on a paved road their entire life, but that's not really reality. That's not really what happens. Hard work, dedication, planning, and focused and endurance is the journey to success. Success is measured in a lot of different things, not necessarily financial, but it could be project-driven, it could be relationship-driven, it could be opportunity or positional-driven. So we're going to talk a little bit today with Scott Wingerter. We're going to talk with him a little bit today. Scott is a veteran. Thank you. I appreciate your service very much.
My pleasure.
Went into the Air Force at 18 years old, if I understand correctly. Spent some time in Intel, worked for the NSA, a nice little career there for about 8 years, got out, got your degree, became a history professor, ran a school. But in reality, you're a constitutionalist.
Yes.
You love history. You love understanding and talking about the Constitution, basically the path of our government, why it was created, how it was created, who formed it, and really some interesting topics that you and I have had that I want to bring out today.
Sure.
Specifically around the Constitution, the amendments, some freedoms that we'll get into in a later episode. But if I were to just kind of open this up, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us what you're doing today. How can we find you? What projects are you working on? And we'll get into some Q&A around the Constitution.
Sure. Thanks for having me. First of all, Skip, I appreciate it. So I am currently I'm still with Paideia Classical School as a history teacher there. I'm headmaster emeritus, if you will. So I've stepped down from the position of running the school, and I've handed that over to my wife so that I can now focus on some other projects that I'm working on. My best friend started a film production company called Sixpence Productions. It's located here in Magnolia, in Montgomery County. And what we're working on is we're trying to basically win back the culture, right? Because that's such an important thing. As you said, I'm a constitutional conservative, right? And when I look at the situation that we find ourselves in, we call ourselves conservative, but yet we've, ceded every single major aspect of culture in America to the left. We've ceded K through 12 education. We've ceded the universities and the academies. We've ceded the media, art. We've ceded over, film and cinema and TV shows. And so basically all culture. It makes you wonder, we call ourselves conservative. What are we conserving? And so that's why I've signed on with Sixpence Productions, and why we're fighting the good fight so hard is because we really need to have our conservative voices in film. So we're working on a project right now. We actually just went public with it. It's called In the Shadow of High Places. You can check it out at highplacesshow.com.
Highplacesshow.com. Okay.
Correct. Yep, and it's basically it's a TV show that takes on the questions about life and death and the relationship between the two, and in particular, it takes on the issue of abortion.
Wow, I mean it's a pretty volatile, what I would say, conversation. It's interesting you bring this up, and we'll get back. I want to get back to Sixpence in just a minute.
Sure.
I just got back from D.C. and I went to the National Association of Christian Lawmakers organization. Senator Jason Rapert from Arkansas created that and founded that organization specifically to bring Christian lawmakers together from all states and all walks not Republican, not necessarily Democrat, but just legislatures, lawmakers that can work together and create legislation that works for all states.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really fantastic organization. I really highly encourage people to go out and check out the things that NACL is working on, and that abortion topic is one of their top priorities.
Absolutely.
And of course, obviously freedoms and things that go along with
Sure.
that. But that is definitely one topic. But for sixpence, let's back up and unpack that just a little bit. For sixpence, it sounds like you've taken on a huge monumental project right off the bat. Very controversial. Obviously, it's divided right down the middle. And so tell me what's driving that.
Well, let me just be frank about that. We originally weren't planning on touching this for some time. We have a bunch of projects that we could have picked to really focus our efforts on. We do have another show that we were working on that's kind of in a holding pattern right now due to some other stuff. But originally we weren't planning on doing this because it's such a controversial topic. You know, you don't want to just walk into, you know, a room, guns blazing, right?
Yeah.
Onto
it's
the
like
scene.
walking into a buzzsaw.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So that was not our logical intent. But as we prayed about it and you know, sought guidance from the Lord on what to do, we just felt like this is exactly what we were supposed to do. This was the time to do that. And so that's what we're currently pursuing. So
let's I want to back up a little bit and let's create a context.
Mhm.
So let's talk about your position at the school. So as headmaster, I'm assuming, and the name of the school was?
Paideia Classical School.
I'm assuming that's a biblical worldview school.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so your context or your view on this topic is coming from a biblical worldview. You feel like it's obviously something that needs to be focused on.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about the show and what is it going to highlight? Is it documentary? Is it situational awareness? Is it communication? Tell me kind of the overview. And I don't want you to spoil it.
Sure.
But just give me the overview.
So it's a supernatural thriller. It's fiction, you know.
Okay.
You have basically 4 different stories that are interwoven together. It focuses on 2 sisters. One's kind of you know, was the family's golden girl, and you know, she did everything right and everything like that, and the other one sort of was a rebel and has moved away. So she grew up, the first sister, you know, that she's a pathologist, she works in a lab, she has a family, she's close to her parents, she grew up in the Christian home and all that stuff, goes to church, you know. The other sister is basically working for an organization that's not Planned Parenthood. You know, we can't use Planned Parenthood without getting sued, right? But yeah, it's an organization that's loosely based off of, you know, the real life Planned Parenthood, and so she is basically she's in a place where she could take over that organization. Also, you have a group of reporters, undercover journalists that are looking to break a story and are investigating this not Planned Parenthood organization.
So like OMG?
Basically, yeah. So this is all based off...
So there, for those that don't know, James O'Keefe left his other organization, which we won't give any airtime to, and created OMG, and they have the embedded whistleblowers, if you will, or embedded journalists doing what you're describing in this show.
Right.
Okay.
And then you have her father, the 2 girls' father. He was in Vietnam, and so we have flashbacks to Vietnam and dealing with life and death through that as well. And so I think I could say this. So the guy that's going to be playing Jack, that's the character, that's the father,
Dad.
is Kevin Sorbo.
Nice.
And we have his son that is going to be playing the young Jack, and his name is Braden.
You know, what's interesting, I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about the Constitution today. And, you know, this show called Dirt Road to Success is really kind of a platform to talk about, you know, where we start, the journey we go on to get to where we need to be. And listening to you talk about sixpence and your passion and really your obedience, I would say, to what God has called you to do is that, hey, we were going this direction, but God instilled in us we need to cover this topic.
Right.
So I say that to say your path, your dirt road is about obedience. And you're obviously the person that is obedient to God doesn't go through the easy street.
Right.
There is a lot of difficulty sometimes in going through that path. And it sounds like to me you've gone from a military intelligence, and I'm not going to get into that in this show. I want to bring you back and talk about your time at the NSA.
Sure.
You go from military intelligence, NSA, to teaching the Constitution, to teaching history, to running a school with a biblical worldview, to now developing a platform where you can highlight and develop a narrative that's specific to life.
Right. So it's always been about serving, right? I mean, I tell my students this all the time. It doesn't matter what you do, right? Whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or a banker or a teacher, a garbage man, none of like what you do doesn't matter. You're always going to be serving other people in whatever it is that you're going to be doing, right? And so
Service above self.
Right, exactly. And so I've always looked at it like that. It's like, okay, I'm going to end up being a servant in some way, shape, or form, right? So what can I do that will have the most impact on, you know, my community, on, you know, the people that I love, that, you know, my state, my nation, you know, and it can get bigger from there, right?
Sure.
And so that's what I've always tried to embrace and do is, you know, look at the situation and say, okay, how can I make the biggest impact for the greatest amount of good with the resources that God has given me?
You know, you're saying that, Scott, and that's the whole purpose of my podcast, is I want to be able to share opportunities where people can get information to do the very best that they can. I want to serve the people that watch. I want to serve my viewers. I want to give them enough information to not make the mistakes that I made or others have made, and help them create a pathway that is less full of potholes, that may be slightly more paved than the dirt road. Any journey we go on, whether it be in your career, whether it be in growing in your faith, whether it be living in your family and trying to navigate those situations, always has potholes.
Right.
Okay. But talking with the Constitution and that subject, really as a nation, we're on a dirt road.
Yes.
If you go back to the beginning of our nation, the founding fathers, even predating the founding fathers, the whole idea of this country, this nation, this group of states was founded on the dirt road that we want a different path. We want to get out from under the tyranny. We want to get out from under the taxation. We want to get out from under the thumb of a dictatorship or whatever you want to, feudalism, if you want to call it that. We want to get out from under that, and we want to create a new life for ourselves and our family. We have a vision of what that success looks like. And then you think about where the Constitution was started, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. When we signed that document, those founding fathers, in some instances, signed their own death warrant. No different in some instances as you going back to the 12 disciples committing to follow Christ.
Right.
They signed their own death warrant. And so fast forward and you look at the dirt road of what this country has gone down to get to where we are today. And to be honest with you, I believe we've gone back from ground zero again, because we have the precipitous of what we're dealing with today in politics and how the government and the justice system is following the Constitution. In some theories, we might be back at ground zero, because we have and I don't want to use the word corruption, but we have a manipulation, as you will, or a misunderstanding of what the founding fathers really focused on. And you and I's previous conversation really helped me open up and think about, what am I doing to really preserve and protect the country?
Mm-hmm.
What am I doing as a normal, everyday worker, person, citizen of this great state of Texas and the United States? What am I doing to preserve, not conserve, but preserve
Mm-hmm.
the rights of citizens, the rights of what the Constitution stands for and the founding fathers and what they intended? And the answer is not much. So hence we're having this conversation, because what I would like to do is build upon the foundation of what the Constitution is and what the Constitution is not, and really what the founding fathers' intent was. I do believe, as a normal citizen, that is a living, breathing document that is concreted what this country should stand for.
Mm.
But I do believe over time things have happened that have gotten us away from our focus. In any journey, whether you're going from here to California and you punch in navigation, you have a plan. There's a path laid out ahead of you. The same thing applies to getting a college degree or getting a master's degree
Mm-hmm.
or getting a new job or developing a new business. All of those things require some plan, some written, some mental, but they require some plan. And I believe that this nation may be off of our plan.
I would say that we are definitely in a post-constitutional America. We are not following the Constitution is a contract.
So talk to me like I'm a 10th grader, civics class 101. You know, you're the professor, you're coming in, it's first day of class. What's the purpose of the Constitution?
So in order to answer that question, I think we have to go back to the Declaration first. The way I would look at it is...
And that's the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, the Declaration of Independence. So you're talking, 13 years apart, but it's important to understand that I think what I've focused my study on history in particular on is, history is sort of this really big, broad topic, right? So you have subtopics that are underneath there. Intellectual history, which is the history of ideas. Legal history, so the history of law, and political philosophy in particular. And where those three really cohesively meet is this era that we're talking about.
The Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence into the early Federalist era.
And
right?
so thinking of the Declaration of Independence, why was that document written and signed?
So it starts, you have to understand that I really think that when you look at, this is a 2,500 year evolving process when you study intellectual history, which is why I brought that up. All right. So when you look at the ideas that go into this document, you have to go all the way back to like ancient Athens to get all of them, right? Excuse me. Recovering from a cold.
You need something else to drink?
Yeah. All right, let me just
That's
try
the great
that
thing
again.
about editing.
All right. So you have to go back to ancient Athens to really see where all of these ideas come from. That being said, I think that when you look at intellectual history as a whole and with a focus on political theory, I really do believe that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution those are the crown jewels of all human political thought in all of human history. And so the Declaration is the talk and the Constitution is the walk. So really, to answer your specific question, I would point rather to the Declaration of Independence as opposed to the Constitution. You know, it starts off, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, blah, 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 blah. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So there it is, the sentence right there.
From the consent of the governed is
that
a key
to
phrase.
secure the rights,
Mm-hmm.
right? Governments are instituted among men to secure those rights. You could reread it like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the purpose of government. If a government is not protecting the individual's natural rights, then it is no longer a legitimate government. It is an illegitimate government. And so you look at an example like North Korea. Like, I don't have freedom of speech in North Korea. If I'm walking around Pyongyang and I say Kim Jong-il's a fat SOB, they're going to grab me and put a bullet in the back of my head for saying that. However, they're the ones that are violating my natural rights by doing so. I'm allowed to say whatever I want to say. You know, their job, if they were a legitimate government, is to protect the natural rights of their people, which clearly they do not.
And that's one of many countries.
Sure.
In fact, it's just the opposite. It's actually how many countries actually support free speech.
Right. Well, I picked probably North Korea because it's probably the most egregious, quote, government out there. But yeah, there's plenty of government examples where even in places like Canada, you know, which we would think tend to be, you know, a Western style, quote, modern democracy. There are friends to the north. They're, you know, look at how they treated their people during COVID.
Mm-hmm. The truckers.
Mm-hmm. The truckers arresting pastors for holding church.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is not okay either. Canada is not protecting the natural rights of their people. And, you know.
So when you think about the Declaration of Independence, it's the independence of what? Because I'm trying to set the tone of maybe the person who doesn't understand the civics class. So it's the independence of what?
Well, I mean, classically, everyone would say, right, you know, you ask your average Texan 8th grader, they'd say, oh, we're getting independence from Great Britain. No, you're missing the point. It's an independency of the individual, right? That is what we're focusing on. It's very important to understand that there are 8, billion people on planet Earth, right? But by focusing on the individual person, you cast the widest net, because that's what makes us equal. That's the equality that we're talking about in that second sentence of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We have the same equal natural rights given to us by God. You have a right to life. You have a right to, liberty, safety, security, happiness. When you look at some of the other state constitutions that come out of the Revolutionary War, in the 1770s and 80s, there's a whole litany of these natural rights that they spell out that are much more, spelled out than the 3 that we see in the Declaration of Independence.
When you see the signers or framers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, those framers, those men that took a stand,
yes,
against tyranny or against whatever you want to call it, right? They took a stand.
Sure.
What kind of threat were they under pre-signing and post-signing?
It was very clear after the First Continental Congress, which does not get a lot of attention.
What years were this?
That would have been 1774.
Okay. Just a few years before.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They sent what's referred to as the Olive Branch Petition to George III. saying, hey, you're not paying attention to our natural rights, so we're going to not do any trade with England until you restore us to our natural state. We're not going to pay taxes because we don't have representation in Parliament, and so they sent off this olive branch petition saying, hey, work with us here, and we can avoid all this unpleasantness. His response was sent in October of 1775. It was basically saying, I will hang every one of you unless you stop this. You don't have this ability to even bring together this so-called Congress. Disperse, or I will hang you if you persist, is literally was his response.
That's kind of it's kind of pompous and arrogant coming across the pond.
Well, that was traditionally the way that things were handled.
Hang you and get it over. No due process. Just hang you and get it over.
Well, if
with.
you're in open rebellion, no, we're not going to tolerate that. It sort of gives you a carte blanche to put down that rebellion. That's traditionally how things have worked in England. Sometimes for the, betterment of the king, sometimes not for the betterment of the king. If you want to see King Charles I in the English Civil War, the Parliament caught the king and chopped his head off for treason. So, treason's one of those subjective things. Who's committing treason? Well, it depends on who's, in the end in charge, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that was basically it. The king was saying, you guys are committing treason, and if I catch you and you persist, I will hang you.
So under his philosophy of their committing treason, is he had ownership of the North American continent?
Right. Well, so they are subject to him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the important for us to understand, right? Is what's the difference between a citizen and a subject? A subject is, are you ready for this? Subject to the king.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a citizen is not subject to anyone. The citizen himself has sovereignty.
Which is independence for the individual.
Yes.
Develop the Constitution so that we have a framework to move forward, independent and separate and apart from England.
Yes. So America, it says in the first sentence, when in the course of human events becomes necessary for one people, and that's an important phrase, one people. We could spend a whole hour on just that one word. But for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, right? So
entitled them,
right?
Is a key
it is
word.
an entitlement that God has set up this system. So God has set up this system of natural law, which we can get into in a second here. And what he's saying is there's a hierarchy of law. Let's start there, right? At the very top of the totem pole, you have natural law. That is God's law. That is universal in nature.
So what you're saying is the framers are dispelling the myth that we're not a Christian nation.
God is mentioned several times throughout the Declaration of Independence. He is, interestingly enough, you'll see God 3 times in particular that I'd like to mention. He's the legislature, because he's the one that is the author of natural law. He's the executive, because he's the one that enforces this natural law. And he's also the judicial branch, because he is, quote, the supreme judge. So you see the 3 branches of government spelled out in the Declaration of Independence, and it says that God has each one of those branches also under his control.
I find it interesting that you're saying that, and I think about just a few weeks ago when I was at that meeting in D.C., Speaker Johnson came, and he talked about his faith and how his faith, obviously over the legislative branch, but how his faith drives his decision making, and how they now have a prayer room where they can focus on the biblical worldview of how the legislation needs to be developed.
Sure.
And so you mentioned that, and that's why I kind of wanted to bring the light to that.
Sure.
Because, you do have one aspect of the nation that believes we're not a Christian nation.
Sure.
That we're not a nation of Christian-based constitution. But you just talking through those three different branches of government and saying how that they're driven by biblical worldview.
Yes. I would say so here's how I would address that. And we're going to get into that here in a second. Is God passes these laws, and that's what makes natural law, right? So you have a right to life. Another aspect that we have to pay attention to that I think we have lost in our modern sense is if you have a right to life, I have a duty, an obligation that's placed upon me to respect that. So in other words, you have a right to life. I have an obligation not to murder you. Okay? So there's, the flip side of the coin is I have to pay attention to and respect your natural rights, even if I don't like you, even if I wanted to get rid of you, Skip. I can't stand that guy. I cannot murder you just because I don't like you.
I think about, and up to this point, up to the Constitution, the bravery and the, in some respects, solitude. They're on an island, so to speak, making these decisions, knowing full well that there's a nation that would want to kill them to keep them from making it. And that path that they've gone through, that dirt road, has got to be stressful. It's got to be one that is just weighs on the hearts and the minds of these men that are making these decisions. I'm trying to go back, and I love history, and I love understanding what were they thinking and seeing back then. And it was like, I'm going to do this or die trying.
Well, there was but one thought on this side of the Atlantic. I'm quoting Jefferson here from a letter. I think he wrote that in 1820. Don't quote me on that. But he was basically talking about, it was a letter to Richard Henry Lee, who was the original author of the Resolution for Independence, where it says, resolved that these states are independent. It's in the Declaration there, that resolution. That was from Richard Henry Lee. But Jefferson talks about how basically everybody in America at the time understood this concept of natural law. And so I'd like to get into that real quick.
So let me back up. So I'm thinking in my mind, these guys are on an island by themselves, but that's not the case. Everyone that was here kind of had the same concept. Okay, that's great.
And you can see that based upon the writings of the various state constitutions that start to come out in the 1770s and 80s.
So at that time there was unity on moving forward as a nation.
Yes, and that's an important word to use there. How do we define nation? Is nation synonymous with country or government, or it's not? Nation refers specifically to the people. So remember when I said, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people? Well, what does that mean? How are you one people? Well, everybody in America at the time spoke English or English. The common law was a system in place in all 13 states at the time. They were largely, the vast majority of them were Protestant Christians, and so you had this unique culture that everyone, even if you were from Massachusetts and you took somebody from Georgia, the extreme ends, they could get along. They could speak to one another, understand one another. They had the same basic cultural heritage as one another. That's an important ingredient when you're trying to do all this that I think we take for granted. And you look at a place like the Islamic world, they speak Arabic in Morocco and they speak Arabic in Iraq, but you cannot take somebody from Morocco and somebody from Iraq and sit them down and, give them a coffee and have them have a conversation. They can't understand one another. But somebody from Georgia and somebody from Massachusetts in 1776 could.
So the dialect is much more diverse among that language than it is in the English language.
Right. So there was this commonality.
I can understand someone from New York and I can understand someone from New Orleans.
Sure.
Even though I've got my Southern twang.
Right.
I can go between them.
Exactly. And so that's an important thing because that is how ideas are spread, right? Is through language. And so common nouns, right? If we understand, we might have some different common nouns like, I don't know, think about like what you call, is it soda? Is it pop? Is it cola? Is it Coke?
It's all
whatever,
Coke.
Right? It depends on where you are. But
Right.
even if you are from Pennsylvania like I am, and I grew up calling it pop, and I come down here and you all call it Coke, well, I can catch on pretty quick on what it is that you're talking about. So that's an important ingredient, is this one idea of one people, this nationhood, right?
And really, when you think about that, and I've mentioned this in another episode about these guardrails on either side of the dirt road. So really, the guardrails were we were unified in what our objective was. And that's not where we are today.
No.
So when I go back and I'm thinking about this people, this group that is trying to become a nation, is unified in their effort to move forward, develop their independence as a person, as a nation, and separate and apart from the UK or the King, UK,
right.
England. And then also, there's this other part, got along.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah.
For the most part.
Not to scare anybody. And, I really, when I look at our modern day America through that historical lens, I don't think it's inaccurate to say that the United States of America today has not been as divided as it is. You'd have to go back to, say, the 1850s and
the time of the Civil War.
Right.
Is the
right
time
before the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And a lot of it has to do with the things that we're going to be getting into today, right? Is a lack of understanding of history, a lack of understanding of these political, I would argue, truths. We don't have a virtuous people anymore. We don't teach virtue in our schools anymore. And, the writings of the founders and framers both, I could sit here all day long and quote these guys. It says that basically you cannot have a republic without a virtuous people. That this republic was made for a virtuous people.
And if we've lost that,
then we will lose our republic.
Moral compass.
It's that simple.
We've lost our republic.
Whether or not we have or will, that is debatable. But yes, that is the end result, regardless. Whether that's we've already lost it or whether that's coming down the pike still, it's kind of irrelevant unless we start teaching virtue once again to our populace, and creating that one people once again.
Let's talk about that teaching piece, because in one of the other episodes we talked about education and just kind of where that situation is. We do have another episode coming up on education.
Sure.
So let's talk about that. When I was growing up, and I don't like to say when I was a kid, but when I was growing up, one of the things, there's two things we did every day. First thing was pledge allegiance. Second thing was either a prayer time or a silent time that you could do what you needed to do. I don't know today if that's still happening, but as I understand it, that is not happening. There is more defiance against saying the pledge or singing the national anthem. And I don't even want to get into the kneeling stuff because then my face will turn red and I'll probably have some veins popping out of my forehead. But,
right.
But the reality of this lack of patriotism for our country who undoubtedly is the greatest country in the world, or we would not have millions of people trying to pour over our border.
Right? Yeah.
Right? So the reality that we are a nation that has lost its way of patriotism. When I think about other countries, and I'm not some major historian or some philosophical politician, that's not what I do, but just from what I've seen and observed, there are countries that have great patriotism outside of America.
Sure.
And those countries seem to have more of a unified people.
Yes.
I'm going to use that word.
Sure.
We have lost that unification because we have, in my opinion, and it's, you know what everybody says about opinions, but I believe we have lost the patriotism because we've lost the unity.
We are, going through college for my undergrad and, I was an education major and, it was just rammed down our throats. Now, I was in my 30s, going through college, so not the typical experience. I had a little bit more years of wisdom behind me.
Non-traditional student is what that's called, Scott.
Yes. So, they're constantly trying to ram down these people's throat that are attending college that, diversity is our strength. Well, no. Diversity is not a strength.
No. That's dividing you.
Right.
Diversity, dividing
yes.
you so that you're not unified and powerful in one force.
Exactly. I can respect someone's culture. I can respect someone's heritage. I can, that all that stuff's fine. But at the end of the day, like I said, the widest net is the respect for the individual, like you are created in the image of God and therefore are owed a certain level of respect because of that fact. And on top of that, you are endowed by God with those natural rights that I have a duty and obligation to respect.
When we think about duty and obligation, what role does the state play in this duty and obligation to not allow our freedoms to be infringed upon?
So, when you say, first of all, let's talk about rights, because now we're getting into it, real deep here. What's the definition of rights? If you ask the, just man on the street, 99.9% of Americans will look at you like, huh? Right? Which is crazy because, I'm a teacher. If I'm doing a unit on, let's say, the Civil War, right? I'm going to go over to my whiteboard and I'm going to start writing words on the wall, right? Like abolition, the political idea that we should get rid of slavery in the law, period, right? I'm going to start defining these words, right? We grow up, we go to class, we go to government class, we go to civics class, whatever it is that you want to call it. We learn about the Declaration of Independence. We learn about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And, we're told that, it's really important that you understand what your rights are, that you protect your rights, that you stand up for your rights. You see people screaming at the top of their lungs, walking down the street with picket signs saying, we demand our rights or whatever. Ask these people, give me a definition of rights. Don't give me an example like freedom of speech or freedom of religion or whatever. No. Define it for me. Most people can't. And that should terrify you, because why aren't your teachers teaching you the definition of a word when they do that for every other class that they teach, whether it's science or math or English or even history, right? Like every other class, when you get a new word, in order to have a conversation about it in class, right, you have to have a definition for it.
So the definition of rights, you're in your civics class. I'm that 10th grader.
Mm-hmm.
You write on the board what are your rights? And the answer is going to be
that which is morally correct and just. It comes from a Greek word, dikaiomata.
Let's say that again. The definition of rights are
that which is morally correct and just.
That is so easily missed.
Mm-hmm. It's literally, it's right, the opposite of wrong. So you have a right to life.
The opposite light is opposite of darkness.
Right.
Darkness is the absence of light.
Right. And to violate someone's rights would be to administer to them something that is morally unjust and incorrect. So let's use a wild example. You have a right to life. I pull out a 45 right now on camera and just blast you and murder you. Nobody in the audience that's watching this would be like, there he goes again, that crazy Scott. He's just always killing people. Everyone would say, he's not allowed to do that. That's morally reprehensible. He just murdered that man.
Well, no, wait. No, let me stop you there, Scott. Because that's not what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what's happening. And I'll give you an example of that. You have protests all over the world right now promoting and supporting Hamas for doing that very thing in Israel on October 7th.
Right.
I know this is a controversial subject, but what you just described is people would say, Scott, you can't kill Skip.
Mm-hmm.
But yet Hamas, you can kill people in Israel.
I think that line of thinking, well, first of all, it's not really much. I don't think these people are thinking this through, number one. Number two, I think that if you were to grab a hold of them and just have a simple conversation, their entire argument would fall apart very quickly. Because the reality is we do know what is right, what is wrong. That's why we have a conscience.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you talked to that individual person and said,
right.
I need you to bring your sibling up here so I can kill them, they're going to be like, no.
Right.
Well, wait, time out. But it's okay for this to happen here.
Right.
And I think it's because they're disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
It's not their sphere of influence. It's not impacting that sphere.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore I can say what I want to. And I don't want to go down that rabbit trail too much because I think we could stay on it all day.
Sure.
But I want to go back to what you said earlier about the education system. And I go back to, I believe that the education system is not teaching our kids to think for themselves.
No, it's not.
They're the fall in line, do what I tell you to do, memorize what I tell you, and not study the facts for themselves.
Well, that's because that's the system that's why the system was built, for that purpose, to achieve that purpose, right? So, you had John D. Rockefeller in the 1890s coming up with this idea that we're just going to throw a whole bunch of money in making this universal school system, and we're going to output it nationwide in all 50 states. Well, 48 at the time. Well, actually, not even. Arizona wasn't a state yet. My bad. Anyway.
It's okay. Let's go back to 1870.
Okay.
Little community, Erie, Pennsylvania.
Sure.
One room school.
Yep.
One teacher, all grades in one building.
Brilliant. Love it.
Not unified education, but more of we're going to teach you, and not STEM. That wasn't a term then, but
it was classical education.
Classical education, math, reading, I guess science.
Sure.
Just the basics. But you had people that were brilliant that could think for themselves.
Yep. That
would read and study and grow. Church was a huge impact in the community.
It's where most people learned how to read.
Oh, really?
Yep. Sunday school.
Sunday school.
If you didn't have this was way more common in the South. If you didn't have a public school system in place, if you wanted to learn how to read, you went to Sunday school, and that's where you learned how to read.
So I think about and I'm on a rabbit trail for just a second.
No, you're fine.
Because I love architecture. I love old buildings. And I think about traveling to New York and D.C. and, places in Philly or whatever. And you've got these old churches right in the cornerstone of where that community was.
Mhm.
And it was almost as if the courthouse and the church were the best buildings.
Yep.
Okay. And it makes sense that, that was the gathering place.
Sure.
That's where every family had their wedding. That's where they gathered on every week.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was, they wore their Sunday best. It was just a different cultural aspect of, yes, we're going to go. It wasn't a question. We're going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And now it kind of makes sense that, you go to Sunday school and they teach you to read.
Right.
And so many people memorize the King James version of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then versus the way it is now. We have a plethora of versions out there.
Sure.
It's fascinating that you say that. So I got off my bird walk, so we'll go back. but it's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking and I'm like, okay, I've been to New York, I've been to DC, I've been to these places.
Yeah.
And you see these huge, beautiful chapels
Mm-hmm.
where beautiful doors. And I used to go in a lot of old churches when I traveled just so I could see the stained glass and the beautiful, things like that. I've been to Egypt. I've been to Israel a couple of times and seen these ancient cathedrals. And then I come back here and I'm like, wow, it's amazing that was the gathering place that people went on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
And just all of the architecture and the beauty of those places. But then you say, oh, well, that's where they learned to read.
Right.
And maybe even write.
Sure.
Maybe even write.
Yeah, if you couldn't afford a private tutor, especially down here in the South, like that's where you went to learn how to read and write. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And
so now fast forward, Rockefeller, 1890s.
Well, actually, I want to take us back 10 years before 1870.
Okay.
You were in the middle of the Civil War. This is an interesting fact. The United States Civil War is the most well-documented historical event in all of human history. You know why?
No, I don't know.
Because 98% of the Union soldiers were literate, and 89% of the Southern Confederate soldiers were literate. Now, put that fact in the back of your head. We're going to put that on the back burner here, and we'll come back to that in a second.
90 plus, 80 plus, a lot of literacy, knew
Right.
how to write, knew how to read.
Yep.
Letters home.
Yep.
To mama and girlfriend.
Uh-huh.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so Rockefeller comes along. He's already made just buckets of money off of the oil industry in the 1890s, and he decides he's going to spend that money and invest it in good quality workers. So he's going to unveil this education plan that is going to be taken, and he wants it to be dispersed throughout all the states. And if he can get this system in place where you make it mandatory, this is where it starts to become mandatory that kids have to go to school under the Rockefeller plan. If you can get all of these kids to sit down and do this program that he's unveiling, then he's going to basically be able to mold these good factory workers that are going to be coming out of this system. And it really got out of control. The nail in the coffin was done by a guy named John Dewey. Remember the Dewey Decimal System?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, John Dewey, boo hiss, I like to say. He's the guy that totally ruined education in America because he was the expert. And he took Rockefeller's plan and he codified it and made it into the modern public education system that we all know and love today.
Is that what we call it?
That's it, yeah.
Okay, just checking.
So, yeah, we would be better served. Everyone in the country would be better served if we scrapped this system that we all know doesn't work. I mean, it was designed by guys from the 19th century to make good factory workers. Are we factory workers now? Do we produce things? Manufacture
Not as much
things?
as we should.
No. So if our entire education system is predicated on the idea that we're going to try to churn out good factory workers, and then the rest of the economy has moved on from that, even if you are just a pragmatist, this isn't working, guys. So I think I'm in favor of scrapping it, and I'm in favor of going back to the classical education system that we had prior to the 1890s, in which like I said, 98% of the Union soldiers were illiterate under this system. Look at our modern system. Do we have a literacy rate of 98%?
Which we go back to the original question we talked about earlier was, what role do the states play in this scenario? And
right.
And you mentioned, and you got off on the work of the education system, and I think we got to go back to the states are in control of the states.
Yeah, well, they absolutely should be, first of all. But I wouldn't even say that this necessarily needs to be a state issue. It can be a local issue. It would be much better if you had absolute local control here. That's how schools started in America. We're talking in the 1630s.
So if you have a school that is excelling in academics, then guess what? Kids and parents are going to want their kids to go there.
Right, absolutely. And the parents need to be the ones that are in charge. That's how this school systems got started. The public school system in America started with the Puritans in New England. They got together and they would, the parents of a village would hire a teacher. They would interview him themselves and say, okay, we trust you with our kids. That's where you get the one-room schoolhouse that you were talking about.
So let's take that one step further.
Sure.
If the education system, what I would call the business of education, because that's in theory what it is.
Sure.
It's a government agency, government, for the most part, government funded. Our taxpayer dollars go to it. But the education system is not, from an expository view, granular level, teaching on the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, what the Founding Fathers, the Bill of Rights, they're not teaching at a granular level what the purpose and formation of those documents were.
How
for.
could they?
Well, they probably weren't.
Nobody taught them.
Yeah. So if we go back to changing
Right.
the education system, that's kind of where we got to go. How do we get that education piece instituted where the students understand that piece?
Absolutely. So it's about, I think we're in trouble, if I'm going to be frank. There's a bunch of things that we need to do. Like when we first started talking, I think it's absolutely essential that we win back the culture that we were, that I was talking about. And that includes education. Like I said, K through 12 education, conservatives have ceded. The academy and the universities, we've ceded, right? So that's one major aspect that we need to focus on is we need to take education back and win that. And then there's also all the cultural stuff as well, which I'm not neglecting. I just, let's focus on this real quick. How are we funding education now, and how should we fund education in the future? That's literally, I think where it comes down to. The way that we fund education right now is if you send your kid to the government school or public school, like they sit their butt down in that chair, the school gets a paycheck because of it. All right. It's based upon this average daily attendance, right?
That's why, correct. That's why they want them there.
Right. That's why they get really upset when your kid's sick.
You can go after lunch, but you got to be here in the morning.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. They don't care what you do after lunch, as long as they made their average daily attendance, which, again, so all they care about is not educating your kid. They care about the money, right?
And we want to make sure that we preface it with this. There are some fantastic teachers out there.
Sure.
There are some fantastic administrators.
Sure.
Some of the most influential people who shaped my world were educators. And I can go on and on. One, I'll just mention Russell St. Paul. He was a principal of mine when I was in school. If it were not for him, I believe 100% I would not be anywhere near where I am. But he saw something in me and forced me to make a change. So let's go back to the whole theme, the dirt road, right?
Right.
He knew my whole family. His first year out of college, he was teaching my older siblings. So he knew my whole family. I'm the youngest. I come along, and he sees me going the same path. But he saw enough in me that he wanted me to go a different way. And so I did. Now, granted, I would tell you I went the different way, but the dirt road had a lot of deep potholes in it. But I did go a different way, which also gave me a glimpse.
Mm-hmm.
For going to a new school, it gave me a glimpse of seeing what higher education could do.
Right.
Because I'm seeing all of my peers, not my friends, because I say friends loosely, but all of my peers, my classmates are planning to go to college. I'm like, that's not something we really talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gave me the incentive to go on and pursue a college education. Now, retroactive, I've gone back many times and given Mr. Sapal a hug and told him how much I appreciate him.
Yeah.
So there are teachers out there, and there's multiple. I have multiple teachers I could talk about like that invested in my success.
Sure.
That saw potential in me I could not see in myself.
Right.
And so we don't want to blanket.
No, I'm
the
not going to try to
teachers.
call out
Mhm.
any. I'm talking about just sort of the nebulous system
The
that
system
has been,
in and of itself.
right.
Right.
That Rockefeller and Dewey have basically thrust upon us.
Mhm.
Okay, you know, not talking about any person's intentions or anything like that. That's stuck in the system. I mean, my God, I've been in this. You know, I've been a public school teacher.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
so, you know, I'm not trying to dump on anybody. I'm just looking at this system objectively and saying this is not working, folks. And so how do you fix it? Well, you know, I want to applaud here in Texas, Senator Brandon Crichton, State Senator Brandon Crichton, who's the chair of the Education Committee in the Texas Senate, has come out with a bill this last legislative session and all of the special sessions as well for school choice. And I think that's a great idea. I love it. The idea is that we're going to create education savings accounts for kids in Texas, and then they get, I think it was $8,000 in that education savings account, and they can use that towards tuition for private school, to buy books.
Is that
uniforms.
$8,000 a year?
Yes.
Okay.
The problem with Senator Crichton's bill, with all respect, is it only would affect, if it got passed, which it's not getting passed because the House keeps killing it, it only affects 62,000 students across the state of Texas. And we have like 6 million students in the state of Texas. So like, while it's a step in the right direction and is good, and I support it, it's not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
That's the solution.
So if I hear you right, so let's I'm gonna kind of come back
Mhm.
and pull back to it. You know, we're really talking about the Constitution, talking about what the framers wanted, but it really boils down to, it comes full circle to the education department, because if the educators are not educating on the true meaning of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and really what we're supposed to do as a country,
Right.
moving forward, then it's very difficult. Basically, you're creating a generational level of people that don't understand the purpose and meaning of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence.
We need to drastically reduce the size of the federal government.
That's a
You know,
whole
For
nother
sure.
show that
Yeah.
will take multiple series on that one.
but you know, you said we have an education department. That needs to be axed, in my opinion.
Well,
You know, Washington had 4 cabinet members. Now we have 16.
Let's think from a second though, and that's one aspect of
Sure.
everything that we're struggling with as a nation. But if you were to just recap, what are some things out of history, turning points we'll call it? What are some things out of history, 2 or 3, not 10, but 2 or 3 turning points in history that our citizens should know about that may directly impact how they view the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence today?
Sure. So when we say founding fathers, that is, again, a really broad topic.
It is.
Are we talking about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington? Are we talking about people like William Penn, and William Brewster and the Pilgrims, of Plymouth? I like to focus on the idea that we have what I would refer to as planting fathers. So that would be Brewster, William Penn, the first colonists, John Smith. And then we have the founding fathers. And so that's like, the founding generation in the Declaration of Independence.
Well, it's no different in business. You have people who can start a business. You have people who can grow a business and run a business. And those sometimes are not the same.
Sure.
Yeah.
So understanding the difference between those two. And then on top of that, I would point everybody towards the Great Awakenings. There's the first Great Awakening that happened in the 1730s. And then you had the second Great Awakening, and that happened 100 years later in the 1830s, since when that started. So let's go back to the first Great Awakening. So what's happening in the colonies in the 1730s? You have your 13 colonies right along the Atlantic coast, pushed up against the Appalachian Mountains. You have these people that are running around, these itinerant preachers that are spreading the gospel and unifying the American colonists with this new religion, this new religious movement, this evangelical religious movement that simply they referred to in the 1730s as the New Light. This is all happening at the same time that the Enlightenment, which is a secular intellectual movement that is going on, and it is only in America this unique thing happens where you have this Enlightenment, humanistic, academic, intellectual movement that's happening is married with this evangelical Christian movement that's happening at the same time. And the marriage of those two is unique to America. You don't see that happening in England. You don't see that happening in France and Germany and the other places the Enlightenment were happening. And I think that heavily influences the way that the next generation then deals with the political turmoil of their time period, which is the founding generation. What's interesting is you always see with the Great Awakenings, this religious revival movement, you always see that what happens a generation after that occurs is a new birth of freedom. So in the first Great Awakening, you had then the next generation, the founding generation, you have the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, etc. When you go to the second Great Awakening in the 1830s, the new birth of freedom that happens in the aftermath of the Civil War, which is we're going to abolish slavery. We're going to make the free men now citizens under the 14th Amendment, and we're going to give those free men who are now citizens under the 14th Amendment the right to vote as long as they're male with the 15th Amendment. So you have, again, this new birth of freedom, and that's a quote, of course, from the Gettysburg Address. But you always have this movement that occurs. It has to be an intellectual and spiritual and moral movement that occurs before you get anywhere regarding sort of progress towards reclaiming your natural rights.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
If we were looking at this as a nation, and we tend to keep going down this path where we are ignoring or allowing our freedoms to be infringed upon, what do you see happening to the next generation?
We're going to get that next generation in a jam to where either they're going to have to endure the tyranny that we allowed to happen, or they're going to have to fight to get rid of it. It's that simple.
Scott, I appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
Enjoyed this more than you know. Our next segment is going to be specific around freedoms. So I'm looking forward to that.
Sure.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you being here. Appreciate your service to our country.
My pleasure.
Looking forward to having that episode on and digging deep and unpacking some of that stuff while you were at the NSA. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Look forward to you on the next show.